that to open up the debate as a whole. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, the motion before this House tonight is that this House believes that the Catholic Church is a force for good. So before we begin, we must, as you know, define what this motion is. But before we do that, perhaps we should define what this motion is not. Tonight is not a theological debate regarding the existence of God, and we would not wish to make it so. For the purpose of tonight's debate, let us assume that God does not exist. You see, we intend to demonstrate that the Catholic Church is a force for good, regardless of God's existence. So, when speaking of the Catholic Church, we rightly speak of that pre-Reformed Christianity centred around the Pentarchy. Most prominently in this country, you'll all be familiar with Roman Catholicism under the head of the Roman Pontiff, currently Pope Francis. This Catholic Church is based upon an idea of living tradition. Importantly, it also rejects biblical literalism as a mode of biblical exegesis. Force here, we're describing as an action, because as we've said, we're assuming God does not exist. Therefore, good thoughts, prayers are ineffective in this context. Good, we are going to define in the broadest concept. That it is utilitarian, i.e. it desires the greatest good for the greatest number of people, but that it does have an existential quality. It involves the sacrifice of the self, for we all know, do we not, that true happiness is found in service. And yes, that's hard to define, but I think it's quite tangible. So now that we understand our terms, let's begin the debate. You will all be familiar with the great evil that many people have done within the Catholic Church. I do not wish to dwell on that this evening, as undoubtedly you'll be hearing a lot about that this evening from the opposition. My focus this evening is on the great good the Catholic Church has done throughout its history, in every age, and in the present day, which may be of surprise to some of you. So my question to you tonight is, well, what has the Catholic Church done for you or I?
Education.
Okay.
Science.
Well, yes, guys.
Okay. Well, apart from, say, culture, science, art, music, architecture, those other things, let's start smaller, like the foundation of modern international law. You see, that foundation of our very human rights, that protects the poor, that ensures international trade, that has made us wealthy in this country, that is founded upon canon law. You see, in medieval times, in a fractured Europe, it was the Pope who united everyone together and aimed for peace, who presided over Europe and moved for peace. It was the Pope and... Sorry, I'll come to that. It was canon law that preserved Roman law through these so-called Dark Ages, so that at the coming of civic and secular law, which adopted a lot of canon law, and now so much so that modern international law is trying to achieve what popes 500-600 years ago sought to achieve: peace, justice, and aid. What about modern science then? Perhaps we should move there. Well, it's well known that the modern scientific method is developed from 13th century Thomistic principles on philosophy. Maybe an example will help. Father Joseph Murgas, the father of the modern radio, whose laboratory in the back of his church was the breeding ground for a lot of radio science. Of course, his funding was cut, and it was up to his underscore Marconi, who perhaps is slightly more famous, to finish his work. Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, whose work in the fields of Essen formed the basis of our theory of alleles and modern genetics. George Lemaitre, who formulated the theory of the Big Bang. So you can see here this concept of Catholicism intertwined with culture and the basis of modern science. Added to that, crystallography, entomology, electrical sciences, linguistics, pathology, seismology, and the list goes on. What about the empowerment of women? Perhaps a touchy subject for some of you tonight. Well, let's take a look at Sion Abbey. In 1415, it was founded. This is in the middle of these great Dark Ages, when medieval women did not have access to any empowering features. This was a convent of 70 nuns, who were the wealthiest convent in England, who had a vast library, noted it having 14,000 volumes of political work, of philosophical work, of theology, of economics, of poetry. These are educated women, given that position by the church. It was only through the church that women could be empowered at that time. That was, I should stress again, nearly 500 years before secular society pioneered the suffrage movement in New Zealand to give women the vote.
Point of information.
Yes.
But okay, so the church allowed some empowerment inside its own structures, but at the same time, outside of its structures, it was also writing books saying that women's role was.
In terms of the doctrine of the church, my colleague Liam will come to that in a moment. So finally, perhaps the greatest influence of the church is education. You see, the primacy of reason is central to Catholic thinking. Classical antiquity had the Academy in Greece and the Stoa of Rome, but really it was medieval religious orders that founded our common structure of a university, these settings we know and love, halls, constant examinations, the handing over of degrees. There was an aura of privilege, a sacredness actually granted to those universities by papal permission. This was opposed by early reformers such as Wycliffe, who said that the church were these bastions of reason and therefore heretical. But the church said no, opposing reason, that in itself is heresy. What about the Cyrillian alphabet? St. Cyril took it upon himself, such an enormous task to evangelize to the nations, that he created for the Slavs a new language, developed out of their oral tradition, which still exists in Russia, in Ukraine, in many Eastern European countries. Or sign language. It was a French priest who set up the first free deaf school, free education. How good would that be? So what does the Catholic Church do for this world now? So we move from a historical perspective to a current present perspective, and we see that the Catholic Church is the second largest educator in the world after the government of China. It's the second largest provider of healthcare after the UN. It's the second largest provider of emergency relief. And so clearly, these religious institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, underpin civic society. And so all of these points together, I hope, allow you to see that far from being a force of evil, the Catholic Church is actually a force for good. Thank you.